Hey, it's Mazzy. Welcome back. Little Feat, the greatest American live band of the 1970s. And this is the greatest American live rock and roll album of the 1970s. And I say fact. I actually posted this in that statement, but I had a question mark. Is this the best American live rock and roll album in the 1970s? Some agreed, many agreed. I got some other suggestions like Allman Brothers live at Fillmore, 1970s, live at the Fillmore East. I'll get to that when I get to this album, but I want to talk about this great band, Little Feat, showcase my collection, mainly because I want to celebrate, because these are two amazing reissues that just came out recently. And I suggest if you don't know this band, maybe first go for the live album, but then start with these two albums. And these were just reissued by Rhino Records. They've done expanded editions. They did wonderfully. If you're waiting for the punchline, in my opinion, these are beautiful records. And I'll get into a little more detail about it. 1972's Sailin Shoes, 1973's Dixie Chicken. These were produced by Ted Templeton. I'll talk about that because they started with Russ Titleman. These were Warner Brothers A&R in-house producers at the time. And I'll talk about those things. Now, what's great about these two albums, let me give you the bottom line of the punchline. 3 LP set. The first LP on each one is faithful to the original album. All analog new cuts from the analog tapes. Apparently, that's what they tell us. That has been confirmed. Cut by Bernie Grundman. Beautiful, beautiful job. They are better than the originals. They have an improved bass. They're fuller, the stereo separation. They just have a nice sound. Now, having said that, Warner Brothers records in the early 70s sound great. So if you have a original Warner Brothers record, do you need these? Yes, because of the second disc and the third disc. Each one's a 3-record set. It includes something called Hotcakes, Outtakes, and Rarities. And then the third disc are live sessions, live shows from the period of the records on the tours that these records came out. So 1972 and 1973, 2 records produced by Ted Templeton. You may know him from Harpers Bizarre, that great sunshine pop band on Warner Brothers in the late 1970s. You may know him from producing Van Halen, producing the Doobie Brothers, one of the great Warner Brothers producers, along with Russ Titleman as well. I mean, they had a great A&R and production department in the late 60s, early 1970s. And from my point of view, as I was growing up with Warner Brothers, they were my favorite label. They were the most creative label. They were the most artist-friendly label. They would stick with artists. They would stick with Randy Newman and Ry Cooder and Little Feat and Bonnie Raitt and Van Dyke Parks, who kind of worked with them as well. And so many other artists. They would build careers. Obviously, Van Morrison. Of course, Van Morrison caught on sooner than all of these bands. But Little Feat is one of my favorite albums of the 1970s. And if you don't have their records, I highly recommend these records. Little Feat is slightly a spin-off, not really, but 2 of the members came out of Frank Zappa and the Mother's Invention. Roy Estrada and Lowell George had a 6-month stint. And as the legend goes, the rumor goes, is that Lowell George wrote would probably be his best song ever, his most famous song, Willin'. I've been from Tucson to Tucumcari to Hatchby to Tamaulipas, driven every kind of rig that's ever been made, even took the back road so I wouldn't get weighed. And if you give me weed, whites, and wine, show me a sign and I'll be willing to keep on to moving. I screwed that up at the end. But knowing Zappa and his anti-drug stance, I think he said, move on. However, he did kind of help him Little Feat secure a contract with Warner Brothers Records. So he was supportive there. And those who follow me always know that there's a Beatle connection. Of course there is. The spelling of feet, F-E-A-T, is somewhat of a homage to the Beatles spelling of beat in the Beatles rather than B-E-E or F-E-E. So there's the connection. So finally, Little Feat is getting their due, in my opinion. I think it's way overdue, and they're doing a great job. And these are curated and produced for the program by Jason Jones at Rhino Records. And he's done a fabulous job curating the songs, curating the live shows, and putting together these really wonderful trifold packages. Of really great sounding records, highly recommended. What's great about Little Feat, they don't just do one thing. They're not just straight rock and roll. They have that. They have little touches of being a jam band. They got New Orleans funk. They got soul. They got jazz, and they really mix it up wonderfully. And their musicianship is uncomparable to a lot of bands in the 1970s. Again, one of the greatest live bands. So you always start at the beginning, and their catalog starts in 1971 with their self-titled debut album, Little Feat. This was produced by Russ Titleman, who only produced this album. There was some tension apparently, and the later albums would be produced by Ted Templeton. The cover photograph is a beautiful photograph. The only photographic cover they had, obviously, Neon Parks, the great illustrator, would do all the covers after this record. This was photographed by Susan Titleman, who happened to be the sister of Russ Titleman, and who happened to be the wife of Ry Cooder. Now, their original version of Willin' is on this, and unfortunately, Lowell George injured his hand prior to recording, and the bottleneck playing on this version, on this album, is Ry Cooder. Of course, you still have the great vocal of Lowell George on this, and that is arguably his most famous song, covered by the likes of Linda Ronstadt and C-Train and so many others. One of the great road songs, country trucker songs of all time, is on this record. Also, Hamburger Midnight, a record that I believe that was a single. It didn't really get anywhere, but this is a really good, a little bit of a country rock. Again, that early swampy thing, that LA sound. What's great about Little Feat is they didn't just have one sound. They had their swampy southern type sounds, even though they're an LA band. They have rock and roll, jam-like sounds. Just really soulful music. And of course, later they get more into their New Orleans style of playing here. But their debut album from 1971, Little Feat. In 1972, they switched producers and worked with Ted Templeton, as I said. This might be their best album ever, and this is Sailin Shoes. What's great about this, Lowell George was a great songwriter. All those other live bands that put great live albums out, they didn't have the songwriting chops that Lowell George had. This has songs like, again, they redo Willin', finally a more fulfilled version with Lowell George on the slide guitar, Sailin Shoes, Teenage Nervous Breakdown, Cold, 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 Trouble, Triple Face Boogie. 1972, Sailin Shoes. In 1973, Dixie Chicken, they get a little more funky, a little more New Orleans. They mix it up with an Alan Toussaint track on here, and they really have that kind of, that swampy sound. They're getting more into that southern rock thing, but more soulful version of it. Lowell George would also back up Robert Palmer with the Meters on his debut solo album, Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley. And then the entire band, Little Feat, would back up Robert Palmer on Pressure Drop, his second solo album. That's why it has that funkiness. In fact, the first 2 or 3 tracks, I believe, on Sneakin' Sally were actually Lowell George songs. The 2 standout tracks on this album are Dixie Chicken, the title track, and Fat Man in the Bathtub. What an amazing record. Funky, swampy, soulful record. These records really move you. They just make you feel great. And those new reissues add to the pleasure of this record, to the soulfulness of the sound. And they're records that are very crankable, those new records especially. Although if you have these, they're no slouch. They sound really great. Early Warner Brothers records, in the late 60s into the early 70s. are fantastically mastered records. This is where Neon Parks, the illustrator, starts working with them. And he would work with them for the duration, especially throughout the 1970s and beyond. And then in 1974, we get Feats, Don't Fail Me Now, another Neon Parks cover. We got Rock and Roll Doctor on here. We got one of their best songs ever, and Oh Atlanta and Spanish Moon. Paul Barriere, I'm pronouncing that wrong, Barriere, joins in, he had joined in on the last album as a second rhythm guitarist, and it just adds more flavor. Then in 1975, Little Feat's the last record album. Excited to see what they do with these expanded versions. Hopefully Jason and Rhino gang will continue this set if they're successful. So jump in, get these records, buy these records. You got All That You Dream. Again, another great song. A lot of people don't realize how many great songs that Lowell George has written. Day or Night on here, Long Distance Love, Mercenary Territory, and Down Below the Borderline. 1975, the last record album, but it's not the last. Then there's Time Loves a Hero from 1977. This is the album that pretty much led to the breakup, or at least Lowell George leaving Little Feat and the band breaking up for a decade. Obviously, after this, a couple years after this, Lowell George passed away. But this was a very different album musically. It's got still some standout tracks like High Roller, Time Was a Hero, but Lowell George really took a back seat in the songwriting on this, which I think pulls back a little bit on what I like about Little Feat, although I've learned to love this album. I think it's a really interesting album. And Paul Barriere and Bill Payne really kind of take over and push the band in a more jazz fusion direction. Now, not all of it is jazz fusion. High Roller is kind of a great funky number written by Paul. Time Lives a Hero probably is the best and most catchy track on the record. And that is written by Bill, Paul, and Ken Grady. But the final track on side one is the one that really stands out in a different way. It's an instrumental called Day at the Dog Raises, and you would swear that is a song by Weather Report or Return to Forever, Chick Corea's jazz fusion with Stanley Clarke, and that. It's got a very strong fusion, rock jazz fusion to this album. I like this record a lot. It's not one of my favorites, but it's got New Delhi's Freight Train written by Terry Allen, Red Streamliner by Bill Payne again, and Missin' You, a great kind of a country song by Paul at the end. But again, Lowell George takes a back seat on this album, unfortunately, but it's still a strong album. I saw Little Feat twice live, once in 1972 when Sailin Shoes came out in San Francisco at a club in North Beach I think it was called North Beach Revival. And it was one of these venues that didn't last long. It went through so many incarnations going way back to the 1930s or 1940s. And in the 70s, it was a kind of a small club. And they were great. I was blown over by them in 72, 18-year-old guy seeing Little Feat. I also saw Little Feat in 1976, about a year before this album, this live album was recorded, when they played at Winterland, opening up, where they were the middle band opening up for Electric Orchestra. They blew ELO away as far as I'm concerned. They were so good, so funky, so soulful. But I'm still gonna say, and I would argue, that this is the best live album from an American rock band in the 1970s. This is my original hype stickered record from 1978 when it was released. I do have a 1979 Mobile Fidelity. This is an amazing sounding record. They also did a 1990 version. Don't get that version. Run away from that version. This is really good too. And of course, last year, this is Bernie Grundman, Chris Bellman, I think it's Bernie Grundman. Again, Jason, again, at Rhino, curated this. This sounds fantastic. This is a reissue. You can get it for a decent price. I highly recommend it. I don't do a lot of shootouts. I did a shootout in my shootout about a year and a half ago or whenever this came out. This MoFi came in first, but not by a far margin. Every version is great. So I would say bang for your buck for the price. Get the new version of this. And also, wasn't gonna show CDs, but at the same time, Jason for Rhino put together this wonderful box set. It not only has the original album remastered, it has 3 other live shows from Manchester, UK, the Rainbow in London, and Lisner Auditorium in DC, all from 1977. And as a wonderful book, this is a fantastic live set. So wherefore this live rock and roll record, better than any other rock and roll American record in the 1970s, better than Live at the Fillmore, better than any punk record, better than any Stones record, better than any Grateful Dead record. It's a combination of things. First of all, it has the best songwriting of a rock and roll band. Love the Allman Brothers. Love what they do with Mountain Jam, or that's actually on Eat a Peach. Love what they do with their long jams and 10-minute, 15-minute jams. But song for song, the songs on this are sublime. Mostly Lowell George songs. Starting them walking on stage, doing this a cappella, joining the band, going into Fat Man in the Bathtub. The musicality on this, the musicianship on this is bar none better than any other band I've heard in the 1970s. The recording of this, the drums snap. The recording they get of the drums and the bass and the piano are just, there's no equal as far as I'm concerned. Every song on this is a classic, no excess. You got Time Lives a Hero, Mercenary Territory, Spanish Moon. Now, Dixie Chicken. All right, let's talk about Dixie Chicken for a minute. That's, for me, the highlight of this album. And it's really hard to pick a highlight because this is like a greatest hits album. Every song is fantastic. No excess, no filler, no long jams that are wasteful. You have this great Bill Payne piano solo break in there that is really well recorded, has this honky-tonk, like New Orleans style piano playing, and it is brilliant. And with all this great musicianship of the band Little Feat, an added bonus, if you will, is the addition of the Tower of Power horn section. They're on about maybe half the tracks on here. And my favorite, again, going back to Dixie Chicken, I believe it's after Bill Payne's wonderful piano solo that Tower of Power does this great New Orleans style street march horn break in it. And it's just so joyous and it's so uplifting and happy. And the closest I can think of that on a live album, another great live album, would be the live band album that has the horns arranged, I believe, by Alan Toussaint on that wonderful Rock of Ages album. That might give this album competition. I'm still going with this, but that band album is also a contender for one of the top live albums of the 1970s, American bands, even though they're mostly Canadian. They go into Willin' at the opening of side 4, and then they go in this a cappella chorus, Roll Another One, just like the other one, and they do a truncated version of Don't Bogart That Joint, that Fraternity of Man, and of course Apolitical Blues, Sailin Shoes, and Feet Don't Fail Me Now. I'm sure I can't convince everyone there that this is the greatest American live rock and roll record in the 1970s. Someone even said, what about The Who? Well, Live at Leeds. They're British, and it's not the 1970s. I highly recommend these 2 wonderful reissues. But before I close, when I had friends at Warner Brothers, I got this. This is Down on the Farm. Now, this is a record they were working on when Lowell George died. This is essentially their last official record. It's probably the least interesting, but anything they do is interesting still. This came out posthumously after Lowell George had put out a solo record and was on tour. And then there's Hoi Hoi. This is essentially a comp, some hits, some outtakes. Interesting comp, 2-record set. If you see this, pick it up. It's well worth it as a little kind of taste of Little Feat. Again, a posthumous album. This came out in 1981. And in closing, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the solo album by Lowell George. Thanks, I'll Eat It Here. He was touring this album, and unfortunately, when he died, this came out in 1979. And of course, 10 years later, Little Feat would continue on without Lowell George, and they're around to this day. And I did see them once years later. Great band, tight as hell, but I missed the slide playing. I missed the soulfulness and the singing of Lowell George. He was definitely the feet of the band, literally the little feet of the band. It's another story, and the soul of this band, and the voice of this band, Little Feat. Mazzy loves you. Feats don't fail me now.